Now. Okay, hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Amanda Perry. I'm the Executive Director for the NACVS, and I welcome you all to our event. So today we are joined by Asheesh Kapur Siddique and Josh Ehrlich, and we are going to hear about their books together. We're having a double book event today. I am just going to briefly introduce both of our guests, and then I'm going to turn it over to them for conversation. So, Asheesh Kapur Siddique is a historian of the early modern British Empire and early America. He is an assistant professor of history at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and received his PhD from Columbia University. His first book, which we're going to be hearing about today, The Archive of Empire, Knowledge, Consent, and the Making of the Early Modern British World, published with Yale University Press this year, locates the origins of modern data-driven government in the creation and use of archives in the early modern British Empire. He recovers the archive as a center of knowledge and contestation in the politics of empire, and shows how its role was complicated by the challenge of governing in relation to cultural difference. His other scholarship has appeared in journals such as the Journal of British Studies, Law and History Review, and William and Mary Quarterly, and his research has been supported by institutions such as the American Philosophical Society, the Institute for Advanced Study, and the Social Sciences Research Council. So welcome, Asheesh. And he's joined today by Josh Ehrlich, who is a historian of knowledge and political thought with a focus on the East India Company and the British Empire in South and Southeast Asia. Currently Associate Professor of History at the University of Macau. He received his PhD and MA from Harvard University and his BA from the University of Chicago. And we'll also be hearing about his first book today, The East India Company and the Politics of Knowledge, which was published by CUP in 2023. Reveals how the company used its commitment to knowledge to justify its commercial and political power. It advances a new approach, the history of ideas of knowledge, to recover a world of debate among Indian and European thinkers on the political uses of knowledge. His many articles on topics including the boundaries and boundedness of port cities, the making and unmaking of libraries through plunder, the crisis of liberal reform in India, and the origins of Indian print culture have appeared in journals including Past and Present, the Historical Journal, Modern Asian Studies, and Modern Intellectual History. So I hope everyone will join me in welcoming them today, and I will turn it over to you all to get started.
Well, thank you so much, Amanda. And thank you so much, Amanda, for the welcome and for organizing, and to you and to NACBS for putting these events on. I think it's a really great way to create an intellectual community, especially a global one, since we're talking today from two different continents. So that's exciting. I think so. Josh and I thought that we would kind of start out by asking ourselves a question. And so maybe I'll ask Josh first, and then I will kind of maybe respond. But our question was going to be, in a way to, I think about these two books together a little bit. Why is the British Empire good to think with when it comes to the history of knowledge? Why should we put these two things together, as I think we both do in different and interesting ways in these two books? So, Josh, what do you think?
So thanks, Asheesh, and I would like to echo everything you've said. It's great to be here with so many people I recognize or would like to get to know. And I'm curious to hear your answer to this, but mine would be that, of course, the British Empire has been central in the making of the modern world and played a large role in globalization and in the makings of so many phenomena that historians are interested in studying. And for that reason, as well as, more sort of arbitrary matters of what people have studied over the years, a lot of the really formative work on the history of knowledge, even before that term was coined, histories of knowledge of all lettres, were really focusing on the British Empire. So works like Chris Bailey's Empire and Information come to mind, a lot of the work on colonial knowledge in the 1980s after Edward Said, and even earlier works from the middle of the century, before the cultural turn was in full swing. For South Asia, the obvious example is Kopp's British Orientalism and the Bengal Renaissance. So a whole host of classic works that have been influential beyond the British Empire took that as their main subject, or took parts of the British Empire as their main subject. And so a lot of the historiography has clustered around the British Empire, again, partly for the reason of it just being such a large and impactful entity, and partly, perhaps because the tradition was well established there and people wanted to argue with and against it. That would be my answer, something like that. Asheesh, you need to unmute though.
Well, yeah, of course. Yeah, I think it's actually as we were talking, I was thinking that it actually is kind of remarkable when we kind of think back to, some of the formative kind of works that I think people now across fields, subfields, even disciplines at this point kind of regard as touchstones for thinking about knowledge and its history. That their kind of empirical center was, at least in part, the British Empire. I mean, Bailey, you mentioned, but of course, even Edward Said, I mean, he's writing in part about Britain and and of course he's writing also about France. But yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting thing to kind of look back at some of these classic texts and to see how they were very much kind of thinking from this, British angle. I mean, maybe even beyond Orientalism. I mean, Said's Cultural and Imperialism, I think, right, opens with this like famous reading of what is it? One of the Jane something or other. I can't even remember now. But yeah, so yeah, I mean, so I thought I agree with everything you said, and I guess I kind of also in my thinking about this question kind of had I think a complementary response, but one that was sort of a little bit more, I guess, a little less historiographical, and so I think it will complement your answer. So I think the first way that I was thinking about this is that I think that the British Empire, not uniquely, but interestingly, encompassed so many different peoples, places, and institutional formations. And so it, in some ways, I think, presents us with the possibilities, not just a history of knowledge, but many different histories of knowledge that are intersecting in at the same time, and that are sometimes clashing with each other and sometimes complementing each other, and that makes it interesting. You know, whether we're writing the history of knowledge in the British Empire from the perspective of the Crown, from Parliament, from proprietorships, from corporations, as you do, from ecclesiastical institutions, we're contending with a set of actors that all had, different ideas about knowledge, but also distinctive pressures and goals, but which were constantly interacting with each other. And I think that makes it an interesting kind of locus to look at the variety of ideas of knowledge as well as practices that are going on in the early modern world. The other thing that I wanted to add is that I think that that if we look a little bit, I think even beyond how the timescales of both of our books, especially beyond them into the 20th century, I mean, roughly speaking, the kind of the making of the British Empire in a kind of long durée context, I think also intersects with a set of revolutions in media that are really interesting and that reshaped the nature of politics and empire over a very long period of time. From the shift from parchment to paper as the kind of quotidian substrate of government, scholarly, and corporate activity, at the end of the medieval period, the adoption of print and its modifications and its cheapening, and eventually the rise of the telegraph, the radio, television, and the internet. Although those are kind of a little bit beyond our time scales, all of those shifts, I think, have reshaped what knowledge meant, how it was produced, how it circulated, and how it figured in political contestation. And I think, the British Empire, since it tracks those revolutions, as it were, I mean, can be a really interesting site to think about how these different relationships between kind of technology and knowledge and politics were inflecting themselves.
And of course, your book is about that. It's about the making of archives as a tool of empire, both in a very concrete sense, but also in a political and ideological sense. And I want to make sure we get into your book. I don't care so much if we talk about mine, which has been out for a year, but yours is brand new and fresh and exciting. And I want to hear a little bit more from you about um, the archive both as a material place and set of practices on the one hand, and as a political and ideological construct on the other hand. And maybe I'll start by asking you, did these bear any relation to each other?
So I think that's that's a really interesting point, and I think that they did bear an immense relationship to each other. I think in kind of contemporary, especially academic discourse and even cultural discourse, the archive is a thing that people talk about. I mean, like, even these days you go to like a big name box store or whatever, and they'll talk about, their archive of products or whatever. But actually, right, in the period that I'm looking at, in the period that we're tracking, I mean, the archive is a place, it's a set of institutions, and it's a set of institutions, that are located in specific types of networks of power and relationships. It's both, specific places where people go, but it's also places that are embedded in, transoceanic, transcontinental, vastly wide spaces of communication, where people who are in a metropolitan place are very much linked in their thinking about knowledge and in their practices to what's going on the ground in places like the Atlantic world, or in South Asia, or in West Africa. And I think it also is an ideological construct. I mean, as I argue in my, it 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 it's the idea of kind of manipulating written information also kind of form what I would call a kind of epistemology, that is to say, both a way of knowing, but also a set of practices through which through which politics are conducted. And equally, I think you show, I think really brilliantly, that the nature of sort of the politics of knowledge in the East India Company is both, it's a set of ideas about knowledge, but it's also a set of institutions. And you write, for example, about the institutions of education, and especially how the formation of colleges and institutions of learning and the sponsorship and construction of those by the company is kind of a central part of of how they are both thinking about knowledge, but also acting on it, or institution building around it.
Could I ask you to say a bit more about these archives that are the focus? I mean, you're right about the kind of institutions I talk about, and you're kind to highlight that. Um, the institution that matters for you is the archive, but you talk about a variety of archives. Could you say a bit about where those are located and
Yeah.
how they change over time? What's the kind of arc you're tracing?
Well, I mean, I'm tracing the arc where these archives are moving, from they're a central kind of component of them is always and importantly located in the imperial capital in London, and they're actually for a lot of the time not really located very far from each other. And these archives and their documents and the people who work with them are constantly interacting, and they're part of the same sort of social circles and networks. And and there's still places that we go to today to do research. I mean, like, many of us, like, work at Kew in West London when we're working on, state papers or the history of much of the empire, or, the what is today, I guess, Asian and African studies in the British Library, right? Which used to be at one point kind of the India Office records, but now,
Well, it's
is
been
still
weirdly recreated there, right? So you see
exactly,
the East India Company crest on one wall, and then the paintings that used to
absolutely
adorn
right,
East India House and Leadenhall Street are on the walls. So the Persian ambassador is looking down on you from on
absolutely
high while you're doing your research. It's kind of compelling, but also creepy, I find.
right. And I think actually in a way that is more powerful. I mean, that is much more powerful at you know, at Asian and African studies than Pew,
Mm
which is now like,
-hmm.
is like a hospital sort of vibe and very sanitary and stuff.
Yeah.
But um, you do have a sense of how I think the kind of the control of information and ideas of political power are kind of intermeshed in the sense that you have right you have the company like literally looking down on you as you are kind of thinking about its history, writing its history, et cetera. And um, I think that obviously, the company doesn't control its records anymore, but like in time it did, and it very much
Mm.
wanted to, deploy them and use them in ways that enhance their, their political power, right, and their economic power and their financial power. And so, um, these are documents that today, right, we go and we look at them and we try to extract information from whatever projects that we're looking at. But um their contexts, right, and as you show, are very much ones that are distinctively early modern. I mean, you write, um you write, for example, about, I think, uh, really brilliantly about both Hastings and Cornwallis, two people who um, are really embedded, right, in sets of very particular uh, uh, problems of government, about how to relate to the problem of governing over people who don't speak your language, who come from a kind of completely different cultural background. And they're trying to find really distinctively 18th century solutions to those kinds of problems. And I think I think one of the things that's exciting about, thinking about the history of knowledge is that um, we can see what's also what is familiar, of course, to our own time, but also what is distinctive and strange. And I wonder if you, um, in your work on Hastings, how you kind of dealt with that issue of trying to place sort of Hastings back into his context, because he's somebody, right, who a lot of people kind of like go to as like Clive, the founder of whatever, modern British
Mm.
India, et cetera, et cetera.
One thing I really enjoyed reading your book, and I'll get to your question in a second, um, was seeing all the points of connection with my own. I mean, quite selfishly, I enjoyed getting your take on a lot of the same figures that I'd been tracing. And you have another take on Hastings. He's this archivist who's trying to marshal an Indian archive as a source of authority for his government in Bengal. I thought that's fascinating and very compelling. Hastings has been seen by others, by Robert Travers quite influentially and intelligently as constructing this edifice, at least, of a successor state to the Mughal Empire, carrying on a lot of its traditions in law and in government. And he's expanded on that to show how, in fact, the systems were kept up or attempted to be kept up. My own take is a little different from that as well. I really came to see Hastings as desiring a strong and robust sovereignty and defending it with whatever tools were at hand. At one moment claiming the mantle of Mughal sovereignty, at another moment claiming to be a loyal servant of the East India Company, at another moment a loyal servant of the crown, really grasping at whatever was at hand, quite inconsistently, and depending on his audience, depending on the particular political moment he was in across his long tenure in Bengal. And I saw at the same time that he was completely unable um, to exercise such a sovereignty, although he might have fantasized about it. And in fact, he was forced to do the bidding, or at least work within the structures of this fundamentally hybrid entity, the East India Company, which remained a commercial sovereign, which remained bound up in its old commercial activities and structure. And he was forced to work within that structure and to devise a mode of politics that was suited to it. I call this, and in fact, using his term, a system of conciliation.
Right.
And this is where all of his knowledge projects come in. He believes that by patronizing Indian scholar elites and European scholar officials, he's going to win influence, win favor with political classes at both ends of the company's empire, both in Britain and in India. So patronizing scholarship wins allies for this embattled company that's in a moment of crisis and criticism on all sides when he takes the reins of government. And so that's really the way that I came to see Hastings, and in particular his engagements with knowledge, but more broadly, the kind of predicament he was in and why he had to do things a bit unconventionally.
Right.
He was in a moment of political crisis, and this is where knowledge comes in as a resource that he can lay claim to. And like all of these other resources that he's grasping at, he's using whatever comes to hand.
Right. Right.
Another
Yeah,
individual, I want to ask you about another individual that links us or links our two projects, and you may be able to guess who I'm going to say, John Bruce.
right.
So maybe I will ask you first, where does John Bruce come into your account? And then I will tell you, or tell the audience really where he comes into mine.
Right. I mean, I kind of call him the last early modernist, which is a big claim, obviously. But I see him as somebody who really is, I mean, just for for people who haven't read the books, I mean, he is so John Bruce was kind of an official at the end of the 18th century who both kind of was like the archivist of the East India Company, though his title was as historiographer, which is a very interesting kind of title there. But he also was the keeper of state papers, and so he essentially was kind of in charge of both the archives of the company as well as of the state paper office, so kind of the Crown's. And I treat him in my book as somebody who, at the end of the 19th century and at the end of the 18th century and at the beginning of the 19th century, was trying to kind of continue to persist in the same types of political practices of archival government that I trace in the book, of trying to justify policy based on its reference to documents, to the specificity, to the granular specificity of the past, and trying to both think about policy making in relationship to kind of archival precedents. And he also is somebody who tried to think about reorganizing both sort of the state paper office as well as the records of the company to what he believed was to kind of increasingly facilitate this work. And what I argue in the book is that he's doing this actually at a moment when kind of the grounds on which political practice are operating are shifting in a way that is taking politics increasingly away from the archive and toward an idea of politics grounded in far more abstract, possibly even universal laws, especially a very abstract idea of the market. And that in some ways he, as well as a few other people who I talk about in the book, but he is kind of the focus, find themselves sort of losing their ability to both kind of influence or think that they can influence politics, and then eventually their offices themselves. And so I see this moment of kind of the really the late 18th century, early 19th century as a moment when the kind of the epistemologies of politics are shifting towards something that we might think of as increasingly modern. And so, I mean, that's a big claim, and maybe
But it gets
people,
at the heart of your that's the heart of your book, I think.
yeah, but I do think that it'll be interesting to see as people tear my book apart. What people have to say about that. But yeah, that is the claim, and and I wonder also, because Josh, you and I have talked about him for many years. How does he figure into your story and your thinking? He's a very interesting person, and I would just add to just like, so if folks who are listening like ever look at some of the like old printed catalogs of like the pub what became the public record office, I mean, you'll see his name there because he kind of you know made them when he was in office. So he's somebody that in a lot of ways we all sort of have interacted with at some level. But Josh, please.
Well, I think you paint really a much richer portrait of him than I do. He comes into my account only briefly, but he comes in, most importantly, I think, in the 1810s. I think it's in 1816. He's laid off by the East India
Right.
Company and
Yeah.
complains bitterly about this. It's really funny, actually. He can't believe he's been replaced with what he calls a literary hack,
Yeah.
who's mostly famous for a cheap edition of a chess manual. Basically, he thinks it's just to save his salary that the East India Company's court of directors
Right.
has done this. And I think it's not only about that. This is coming on the heels of the 1813 Charter Act.
Right.
Bruce had done all of this kind of labor, painting this history of the company as both a sovereign and a merchant, and showing how the two functions of the company were braided together. And this, he thinks, or he claimed, played a role in getting the company's charter renewed on favorable terms in 1793. He tries the same thing, publishes all of these glossy histories of the company in or around 1813, but it doesn't work. The company's commercial privileges are largely stripped away. It's left with only the China route left. And so this is a sign of his literary efforts not working. Moreover, the company is starting to lose faith that scholarly patronage is really doing it political favors by this time, not only for that reason, but for a host of other ones that I talk about in the book. So I see this as part of the company becoming less interested in patronizing scholars. And by this time, it's starting to get interested in education. So the final chapters of my book are really about this turn from Hastings' old system of scholarly patronage as a way to conciliate power holders and political classes, a change from that old system to a new one of mass education, and mass education as a way of cultivating broader constituencies, both in Britain and in India. This is the big turn from one set of ideas about knowledge to another that you see in the course of the body of my book. And so Bruce plays a little, but I think very telling role in showing that change in the 1810s in particular.
Right.
So he enters in very briefly. Can I turn to ask you a little bit about the place of non-Europeans in the archive? I think you write very eloquently about the ways that they are erased from the archive, not taken into consideration. I want to ask if there are exceptions to that at all,
Right.
or what you have to add to a story that's been told to some extent before, because I think you do add some important details to that somewhat familiar account.
Yeah, I mean, I am really interested in precisely that question, and one of the things that I argue in the book is that uh, we there's a way in which uh, we tend to there was a certain kind of historiography that was very interested for a very long time, right, in you know the other of the British, basically, right, and and was interested in how that question of sort of what was the other of the British formed issues of sort of national self-definition or imperial self-definition. But I think that, and that was a very important and really rich and generative historiography. I think that there was a maybe an implicit tendency to confuse that question with how governments or government-like bodies like the East India Company thought about the question of cultural difference, which I think was much less about sort of identity and but much more about sovereignty, which is to say, how do you govern in relation to people who are different than you are, and what are what are the rules that should be used to do so, and what are the kind of the intellectual resources that you need to do that. And one of the big claims in the book is that actually the answers to that are quite different in South Asia than they are in the Atlantic world, because of the particularly complicated ways that um, uh, uh, non-Europeans, especially indigenous people, are figured in relation to, imperial sovereignty. And basically, right, the claim is that in the Atlantic world, they really, by the time of the 18th century, they aren't. I mean, the 17th century is another story. But in the, what makes in some ways South Asia so interesting is that they are, right. There is this idea of the company becoming kind of subordinate to a Mughal ruler, and therefore kind of executing um, Indian practices of governance, even though it is a European institutional formation. And then there's the kind of the third, right, I think quite different from those two issue of difference, which is the relationship between uh, uh, empire and enslaved people, who are not who are commodified in this kind of imperial imagination, and are neither thought of as either kind of subjects or necessarily as external to the political body. And as a result, I think that the way that these three very different types of groups that sometimes we used to, I think, maybe just kind of categorize as just generally under the term of kind of the other of the British, right, are actually inflected in very different ways in relation to both, British to sovereignty, right, to governance, and possibly also to culture, though I don't really get into that question. And so I was interested in trying to suggest that maybe that question of how, the Britain and its others were related to each other, that there was a lot of really interesting insight that kind of the cultural that sort of the cultural analytics that were brought to that question for, now I think 2-3 decades, right, answered, but that there's still this question of, well, what about governance, right? What about the exercise of political power beyond, say, cultural representation? And so that was a question that, I don't think, this, my book maybe opens up a little bit. I mean, I think there's so much more that could be done. I think particularly, honestly, the history of the British in West Africa is severely underwritten.
Yeah. Does it matter for you, or what do you make of the fact that in South Asia, certainly I know this to be the case, archives were often managed by Indians, under British employ, and increasingly under kind of British supervision in later years. But for instance, the first superintendent of the Madras archives, created in 1803, was Elevan Badu Mutia, a kind of Tamil Mudaliar, middling class administrator in long service with the East India Company.
Right.
And then you have the Khatri scribes that Bhavani Raman and others have written about in charge of the kind of record offices. Do you think it matters, or is it important in some way that
I think it is important.
Characteristically British institution is often, not being managed by British hands?
Yeah, I think it is important. I think it is really interesting. And I mean, presents, I think, a very, very distinctive contrast to how empire and Indians in the North American context related to each other. I mean, it would be it would be kind of inconceivable for what you were just laying out to happen, and not so much, I argue in the book, because there's a kind of a very old well, it kind of became a historiography, but it really originated in kind of the anthropological literature of the 70s and 80s that was very concerned with this question of, like, what cultures have writing and what cultures do not, and whether, the success of empires was tied to the fact that they came from cultures with writing, and that, other cultures that didn't have written records or didn't produce written records, kind of were the victims. And so writing is power, kind of. And I don't, I think that that was a kind of a moment and we've moved on from that. But, one of the things I don't really get into a little bit, but I try to point out a little bit is that, I mean, that's not really true if you take a little bit of a broader vision of what like writing is. I mean, people now have written a great deal about record keeping among kind of Native Americans, who were said for a very long time to be kind of like, people without forms of written information. And in the context especially of work on early modern Mexica people and others. I mean, we have really rich accounts now of how they created different types of codices, et cetera. And so I think that it's in some ways time to really put that literature to bed, and to take a much to really kind of locate our questions about knowledge and questions of sovereignty and political power, rather than this sort of amorphous category of culture that I think was had a very powerful hold on historians um, for a lot of years. And that's not because culture isn't important, but it's because culture is rooted in political power and in institutions, right? And we
You
want
sound
to
like
try to
me in my book, Asheesh. I
say
think we
again.
really agree. I think we really agree about that.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
I've probably said similar things before, and we probably had these conversations before,
Yes.
and
Yes.
it shaped both of
Definitely.
our
In
thinking.
in some of the archives, which we ended up writing about.
Yeah. So I think we're probably at about the right time to turn to the audience, if not past that time. Do you
Yes.
agree?
Yes.
Okay, we'd love
Definitely.
to hear from you. Any questions for either or both of us? I see Vera's hand up,
Yeah.
but that might just be the first one I noticed. Do you want to go first, Vera? But we can't hear you, I'm afraid. At least I can't.
Oh, I wonder, do you think it's set up so that maybe not everyone can talk?
I should be able to hear you, Vera. But you could drop it in the chat also.
Yeah, we can do it that way. You can type it and we'll look at it. Okay, anybody else while she joins from another computer?
Okay, so where do we stand on Homi Baba on hybridity and creativity?
Probably pretty far away. I haven't thought about that in a long time.
Right, okay.
And I don't mean dismissively at all, but maybe it's something I ought to return to. What do you think, Ashish?
Yeah, I think probably pretty far away. Yeah, I mean, I think wasn't sort of on the wasn't really on the radar screen. I think because it feels like there's so much rich, like now, I mean, historiography on, knowledge and empire and sort of, and knowledge and the state. And, um, uh, and I mean, also, I mean, at least in my case, I felt like even insofar, like, there's out actually like a lot of literary scholarship on the archive and on like the materiality of texts that, that in some ways kind of moved a little bit away, I think, from um, that the post-colonial theory, both notion of what imperial knowledge was, and also, right, I think importantly, what kind of post-colonial theory figured as like the archive, which was this abstract kind of formation that wasn't necessarily tied to a particular place in time. And I think actually, like, I mean, now, I think, to paint a little bit of a broad brush, I mean, I think early modern literary scholarship has really actually become very much focused on the materiality of texts.
Yeah. Okay,
Vera,
Vera,
do you
want
want
to
to try
again?
again?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, I gave a talk myself at 5 o'clock this morning and I had the same problem. And now I know it's me, it wasn't them. So many interesting questions that are spurred by this, and I had a bunch from the beginning, but I'm just gonna ask one from where the conversation was ending, which is about archives as the quintessential kind of British cultural product, because you're operating in a situation where I think of archives as quintessentially a marker of Persian and Babylonian kingship, and that those are kind of legacies of kingship that all of the empires in the area are kind of battling for control of and modeling themselves in that tradition. So I'm wondering if we could turn kind of the history of empire and archive on its head a little bit in this particular geographical setting.
I think that's for you, Asheesh.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think, I mean, in some ways, to paint a little bit of a broad brush, I mean, maybe, the type of history that one would trace, and that, I mean, I basically trace at the end in this book, which is kind of an 18th century or 17th, 18th century of archives and government or archives, is in some ways the tail end of a very, very long history that, should go back, could really go back to exactly, Vera, what you what you were just talking about, which is the ancient world, in which, the collection, I mean, at that point, of course, it wasn't even parchment and paper, but often stone tablets, and cuneiform writing was, instrumental in the way that ancient ancient sovereignties built up their power. I mean, one can think back to the Gerkinaku, which the Ashurbanipal, one of the kings of Sumeria, built, which was this famous kind of ancient cuneiform library that was very much controlled by him and his court. And when we look across the ancient world, right, we see all kinds of examples of these institutions that, they're not at that point, of course, bound to paper, nor are they bound to parchment, but they are bound to various types of material forms, cuneiform, stone tablets, papyrus, et cetera, et cetera. So, maybe we're kind of at maybe the histories that we're tracing are kind of at maybe an endpoint of this, when things are really kind of going to move in a very different media direction, with first the rise of things like the telegraph, and then eventually, more different technologies like radio, television, and the internet.
I see a question from Edward in the chat on the relationship between the East India Company's knowledge gathering and the Bengal famine of 1770. I think there's a pretty direct relationship. The Bengal famine is one of the things that is really producing this crisis for the East India Company in the 1770s. It's a crisis of what we might call public relations, and that the company is widely blamed, and probably largely rightly blamed, for the famine. And it's also something that devastates the economy and the polity of Bengal. And so it's one of the real disruptions that Hastings is trying to stabilize. And one of the reasons he turns to these unusual means of seeking legitimacy, such as patronizing scholars on a new scale. He has to repair the situation, repair the damage that's been done by things like the Bengal famine right before he arrives on the scene in 1772, just 2 years later, finding a state in disarray, unable to collect revenue because the population has shrunk, because the farms have been devastated, because there's chaos in the revenue gathering system. So I think there's a pretty direct link. And then I see Jocelyn's hand up. Would you like to ask your question, Jocelyn?
Sure, yeah. Thank you both so much for such an interesting discussion so far. Um, my question is, so thinking about like government knowledge production, especially in the case of the East India Company at the end of the 18th century, how does that relate to kind of the legacies of Enlightenment knowledge production and like shifting ideas about human difference? Specifically thinking about how race as a category was shifting at this point in time. Yeah, so I'm just curious what you guys have to say about those connections as well.
Asheesh, I'll let you go first. But you have to, yeah.
That's fascinating. I mean, I one of the things that I think is interesting. I mean, this is very speculative, so I could be completely wrong, but it does seem to me like, one of the things that happens, right, especially in the 19th century, is that the question of human difference moves from being answered in the types of kind of granular practices of like manuscript collecting and sort of like reading and the cultivation of the so-called like ancient literature of different civilizations in order to come up with you know ideas of human difference, to these much more abstract, disembodied, ungranular ways of making that type of knowledge, and questions of practices of things like I mean, like the examination of bodies and uh, uh, biological ideas and other, I think I would kind of characterize them as maybe non-text based ways of thinking about human difference, seem to ascend both within intellectual circles and then possibly even within government circles as well. I mean, phrenology and all that stuff is quite different, as a quite different method of trying to understand human difference than like going and reading the manuscript heritage of like the past, right? And so I mean, I guess I see that as that perhaps, right, if we kind of take seriously the argument that race is something that's really kind of made in the 19th century, or maybe the end of the 18th century, that it would seem to be a very different type of it would seem to be linked to a very different type of epistemology than the ways that human difference in this early modern world are being conceived and promulgated. So that's kind of my initial thought.
Yeah, I mean, I really agree with all of that. I think what's striking about the period that I study in the book, which is largely Asheesh's period too, are the continuities across the beginning of the turn of the 19th century. To me, this is a quite coherent period. I mean, I trace all kinds of changes happening in those decades, but it's still a period of relatively open and polymathic learning. There aren't the kind of rigid disciplines that later are turn into kind of studies in a supposedly scientific way of race in the later 19th century. And I mean, phrenology is a good example of the beginnings of one of those. You see it cropping up in the 1830s and 1840s, really the end of my period. But I see still all of this kind of quite, I don't know if broad-minded is the right word, because often it's quite, bigoted or closed-minded or something. But let's just say, untrained and questing kinds of research that are going beyond any kind of rigid racial theory in this earlier period. I see a lot of continuity in proto-ethnographic approaches to studying Indian culture, for instance. So I think that's how I would answer the question. There's a lot of continuities across the turn of the 19th century, and you don't yet see a kind of racial science emerging. At least I didn't notice it in researching a lot of these scholars associated with the East India Company. I see a question from Susan. Shall we turn to that one now? Maybe I'll start this one, if that's okay with you, Asheesh. Go-betweens are absolutely part of my story. They're often, the main actors in a lot of the stories I trace in my book. You see that these Indian scholar collaborators, often scholar elites, called pundits or Malvis, are really the main objects of the company's scholarly patronage. They're seen as influential with political classes and rulers in India. And so they're important objects of patronage by governors general, starting with Warren Hastings. And I would sort of sign on to Asheesh's earlier comment that what I'm really interested in is the politics of these interactions, not so much the culture of these interactions. It's the politics that I think matters, and I think we shouldn't subsume them into a kind of broad cultural landscape, or at least that's not what I'm interested in doing as I try to understand the role that knowledge played in the company's ideology.
Well, can I respond to that? Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
I'm Susan Wyman, and my work is, I guess, mainly more grounded in the 18th century. So my go-betweens are very much culturally central. And so perhaps it's that they haven't yet gotten to the period where the politics becomes the engaging thing. But I'm glad that you're still talking about them, because it seems to me that you can get both cultural and political significance from them.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So I think Vera, I see that Vera's question is now in the chat. So I have three interrelated questions from the beginning of your dialogue. What is your working definition of knowledge? How would you distinguish the history of information from the history of knowledge? And is the British Empire good to think with for the history of ignorance? Josh, do you want to?
Sure. Knowledge is whatever people said it was. So I'm not interested in defining it for myself, but I'm fascinated in what people in the past thought knowledge was. So phrenology is a great example, right? I hope we all think of this as a pseudoscience, but if people in the past thought it was knowledge, we should be interested in why they thought so and how they used ideas about that knowledge for political and other purposes. Information, because I'm interested in the actors category, information is also what people in the past, the ones that I'm studying, thought it was. And they did have a distinction between, the information of a news writer, the intelligence of a spy, to use another frequent synonym, and the knowledge of a scholar. These could mean very different things. Of course, they could mean overlapping things too, but I'm interested in the ways that knowledge was different from these other things. I'm interested in knowledge in connection with scholarship and learning. And I think it did have a discrete, distinct meaning in that respect. And that's the one that I'm tracing throughout the book. All the different, definitions of knowledge under that broad heading. Is the British Empire good to think with for the history of ignorance? Yes, but it's not something I do in my book.
I would just add that I think yes. I mean, I think that one could have I mean, and I do this to a certain, I mean, I do this in the book. One could write some of these histories by placing the emphasis on what is there, but outside the compass of what the actors who one is looking at know or think is at least important. And to some extent, I do that. And I think, that could be a very interesting way to to write about these questions. I mean, I think that what is, I mean, I think that in both of like the actors that I think we're all looking at are very invested in projecting kind of constantly an image of epistemic certainty and sort of epistemological sort of power, but that's always paired with the fact that things are escaping their ability to know. I mean, in particularly in a context where much of what they want to know is occurring at, distances that are so far away that they couldn't possibly really know what was going on, or they're occurring in a temporal context where, there's such a long delay between when they get to know things versus when they happen, that that there's a big degree of projection, I think, for a lot of the folks we're looking at about certainty in the face of what is kind of a practical a kind of a situation that is of practical kind of constant unknowability.
I'm looking at Jocelyn's question and thinking about it. Shall I make a stab at answering this? I didn't track any changes directly to this fact, although it's clearly important for all kinds of reasons that the East India Company becomes, after the Union of 1707, a British East India Company. And has increasing numbers of Irish members as well, employees and officials. It does matter that so many links exist with the Scottish Enlightenment, I think. The clearest example of this is John Macpherson, who's Governor General of Bengal for an eventful 18 months between Hastings and Cornwallis. So from 1785 to 86, this really momentous period, which sees the beginning of Hastings' impeachment and trial, not yet trial, but at least the beginning of the campaign against him in Parliament, and the beginnings of implementing Pitt's India Act, which is a big transformation of the company in 1784. All of this backdrop of scandal and reform is occurring when this supposedly enlightened disciple of Adam Ferguson, who is his tutor and lifelong friend, is at the head of government in Bengal. And yet, for most historians, John Macpherson is a complete rogue, the most corrupt official ever in charge of the government. And they've kind of forgotten that while this might be true, certainly contemporaries thought it was true, he was also deeply embedded in the Scottish Enlightenment and saw himself in those terms and justified his rule as turning the company into a broker of knowledge that was going to stimulate progress from Peru to Tibet to Philippines. He had these kind of enlightened visions that he used to justify his regime, and you could say to justify his corruption in Bengal. And I think it's this really eventful moment that's only can be explained, really, if you take seriously both his shady, seamy side and his enlightened aspirations and justifications.
I think Riley.
Asheesh and Joshua. I have a question for Asheesh. Joshua, I really look forward to reading your book, but I have read Asheesh, so I'll go there. So I think the conquest aspect of your book is really engaging with this. There's a kind of robust literature at this point about the problems like integration of different places into the British Empire after the 7 Years' War. I'm wondering if you could speak a bit more to how yours fits into like the broader work. I kind of see there's like a tension between works that really stress the ideological nature of the British response, and then works maybe like yours, but maybe tell me if I'm wrong, that see it as something a bit more empirical. At least it's ideological in a way that they're seizing like these archives. They're doing these investigations into laws. And I'm thinking of Quebec as well as Bengal. But it is a bit more empirical and, justifying what they do, these politics of continuity based on what they're finding, like Warren Hastings fairly strongly, as well as like Sir Guy Carleton.
Yeah, I kind of make the I mean, I make kind of the big claim in the book that, you know, the you know, that the in North America, you know, the problem of um, governing in relationship to Indians, as it were, is really a problem of governing in relationship to people who are considered to be essentially outside the body politic, as if they were, you know, I mean, as they are, I argue, kind of a, you know, a different form of sovereignty. And that's less true in the 17th century, when you know, companies actually do have quite have ways of thinking about the, you know, their relationship with Indians in ways that kind of incorporate that. But by the time that you know, we get kind of the crown involved at the end of the 17th century through the 18th century, I see this as a problem of sort of external actors, and I think that, you know, that presents, I think, a quite a different sort of situation to the one that the company finds itself in Bengal, which is that, you know, it takes on, inhabits Mughal offices, it acts as the executioner of Mughal offices. It conceives of, you know, it says it's kind of under the sovereignty of Indian rule, and is sort of executing that. And I just don't think we get that in the context of sort of British North America. I think we get actually a very different story, which is one of efforts to not to kind of accustom British people to kind of Indian norms, but efforts to accustom Indian people to British norms, through you know, efforts to convert, through efforts to teach English, you know, and then ultimately, you know, quite tragically, to you know, to eradicate those who resist in any form. And I think that presents a very different situation. And, you know, if one might be a little bit provocative, I mean, that's in some ways why there is no North American Indian Orientalism. You know, like, that's why there is no sort of similar type of intellectual movement of the sort that happens in British India, because it's just not how Indians are being thought of in relation to the British. And even if you look at the people who kind of appear to be exceptions to that, like William Johnson, for example, I mean, I think that they actually in some ways, you know, prove the rule. I mean, their goal, like, you know, Johnson's goal is ultimately like Christianization. He's not, right, trying to be seen as you know, an Indian himself in the ultimate way. And even then, he's pretty exceptional. So I think that that's a more powerful explanation than the kind of older culturalist explanation that, you know, basically, you know, North American Indians didn't have writing or didn't have cultures of recording, and that's why they don't have any archives, et cetera, or don't appear in archives. So yeah, I mean, I you know, people will take that up, that argument, and I'm sure have lots of objections and differences to that, but yeah.
So I see that we're over time, but I also see a final raft of really interesting questions from JSL. Amanda, would it be okay if we each pick one of these, answer it briefly, and close that way?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so I'm going to pick the first one about whether my research relates at all to Foucault's ideas about governmentality, I think is what that says, and knowledge. I do think that my approach in this book, which I call The History of Ideas of Knowledge, really blending the methods of contextualist intellectual history with the concerns of the new history of knowledge, offers a response to Foucault, and in particular to Foucault's power-knowledge equation, this famous coupling of power and knowledge, saying that they're indistinguishable from each other. I think actually power and knowledge have a contingent relationship across history. They've been rethought and remade in multiple ways, and by studying those multiple ways, we come up with a much more nuanced and more productive picture of the relationship between power and knowledge than simply saying that they're the same thing, they're bound up together in the same way across all of history. We get a more dynamic picture of their relations. And that's what I am trying to do in some way is come up with a response to Foucault, which I think intellectual historians have not really done. Intellectual historians in the contextualist tradition have not really done in all of these decades that this idea has been resonating and impacting scholarship. So that's something that I very much hope to do in this book is present an answer to Foucault that, again, power and knowledge don't have a static relationship, they have a dynamic relationship. They're not indistinguishable. They've been, again, rethought and remade in countless ways and will continue to be.
Well, I mean, on that point, I mean, I actually think I was not, I didn't find,
But you can pick another question if you want,
Oh,
Asheesh.
okay.
You have a whole bunch to choose from.
Well, okay. Well, let's see. If you've come across moments in which there are conscious attempts to manage epistemic uncertainties, and what are some of the stems? Well, yeah, I mean, I think definitely. I mean, I think that that well, two things. I mean, I think that first, the promulgation of very strict rules about how information should be created and recorded and then circulated back by imperial institutions is an excellent example of how they sought to manage uncertainty. I mean, when you look at how imperial institutions sought to derive rules for for how information ought to be created, circulated, and stored, I mean, you find them, and I discuss this in the book, to be just like profoundly granular. I mean, like nitpicky beyond belief. Like, like send every single one of your letters in triplicate. Make sure you keep like two books that record copies of every letter just in case, and something gets lost and sinks on a ship. So I think that we do see that epistemic uncertainty is definitely something that is of immense concern to these institutions, and that they create these practices that we still of course see traces of in the archive. I mean, like, one of the things I think is so fascinating is when you find just like 10 copies of the same document, sometimes in different in different files or in different books. And that's, I mean, that's partly, right, the reflection of an effort to try to figure out how to both circulate information, but also in a way of how to preserve it and how to make sure that that all of the things that are working against that, from like distance, ship sinking, to like, I don't know, like rats eating paper in some of these offices and things getting moldy or water damaged, which happens. That those are all ways in which people are really trying to manage that. And to me, that's a really fascinating part of the story. I mean, in a world where so many things could really easily go wrong about getting information or getting documents from one place to another. I mean, it's kind of sometimes feels like a little miraculous that so much of it did.
Well, I want to thank you first, Asheesh, for suggesting this. It was fun as always to talk with you. And thanks everybody for all of your questions. They were wonderful, and I appreciate your attention to both of our books.
Yeah,
Cool.
thanks. I just echo that. Thank you so much, Josh, and
And
thanks so
thanks,
much,
Amanda.
everyone, for coming.
No,
And
and
thank you,
thanks.
Amanda,
No, thanks to both of you for such a great conversation, and thanks to everyone for attending. This is going to be our last book event before our annual meeting, and then we'll have another one after that in December that I hope some of you will join us for. But until then, I hope that everyone will join me right now in thanking Asheesh and Josh for this wonderful conversation. Thank you all.